March 15, 2002. 11:47 p.m. Sarah Martinez had been cross-checking surgical schedules for 3 hours when the numbers stopped making sense. 14 patients had been wheeled into operating room Block C that morning. The computer system showed 14 pre-op authorizations, 14 anesthesia records, 14 surgical consent forms. But only 13 post-op recovery entries. Only 13 discharge summaries. Only 13 people had left St. Francis Hospital alive that day. The missing patient wasn't a clerical error. Sarah had worked medical records for 8 years. She knew the difference between a filing mistake and something else entirely. This was something else entirely. Because when she tried to access the 14th file, the computer screen went black. When she asked Dr. Morrison about the discrepancy, his face went pale and he told her to focus on her own responsibilities. When she mentioned it to the charge nurse, Patricia simply said, "Some things are better left alone, honey." That's when Sarah realized the most terrifying truth of all. Everyone knew. And everyone had agreed to never speak of it again. What happens when the people we trust most with our lives decide some secrets are worth more than the truth? When medical professionals, sworn to do no harm, choose silence over justice. Stay with me as we uncover what really happened in operating room Block C, and why 14 became 13 in the span of a single day. Because sometimes, the most dangerous place isn't where you think it is, it's where you go to be healed. March 15, 2002, 6:30 a.m. The morning of March 15 started like any other at St. Francis Hospital. Sarah Martinez clocked in at 6:30 a.m. sharp, just as she had every weekday for the past 8 years. The medical records department was quiet at that hour. Most staff wouldn't arrive until 8 o'clock, giving Sarah 90 minutes of blessed silence to tackle the mountain of paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight. She settled at her desk with a steaming cup of coffee, its bitter warmth cutting through the hospital's perpetual chill. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above her head, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made everyone look slightly ill. Outside her small window, she could see the morning shift change happening across the parking lot. Nurses hurrying toward the main entrance, their scrubs bright spots of color against the gray March morning. Sarah had always been good with numbers. It was why Dr. Harrison had promoted her to Senior Medical Records Coordinator 2 years ago, trusting her with the complex task of ensuring that every patient's journey through St. Francis was properly documented. Every admission, every procedure, every discharge, it all had to match up perfectly. Insurance companies were getting stricter about their audits, and one misplaced decimal could cost the hospital thousands. That morning, she was working on reconciling the surgical schedules from the previous day. March 14th had been busy. Spring seemed to bring out more accidents, more emergency surgeries, more complications from winter illnesses finally reaching their breaking point. She pulled up the master surgical schedule on her computer, a green-screened IBM system that the hospital had upgraded to just the year before. Operating room Block C had been particularly active on March 14th. She scrolled through the entries, her practiced eye taking in the familiar patterns: patient ID numbers, admission times, assigned surgeons, procedure codes. Everything looked normal at first glance. Room C1, Patricia Henley, 67, gallbladder removal. Dr. Chen. 7 a.m. start time. Room C2, Marcus Johnson, 45, appendectomy. Dr. Morrison. 8:30 a.m. start time. Room C3, Elena Rodriguez, 72, hip replacement. Dr. Patterson. 9:15 a.m. start time. The list continued down her screen, each entry representing a human being who had trusted St. Francis with their life. Sarah had learned long ago not to dwell too much on the personal stories behind the medical codes. It was too heartbreaking, too overwhelming. But she always made sure the paperwork was perfect. These people deserved at least that much. By 8:30 a.m., the medical records department was filling up with her colleagues. Janet Wu arrived with her usual bag of homemade cookies, immediately launching into a story about her teenage son's latest driving mishap. Tom Bradley shuffled in 15 minutes late, as always, mumbling apologies about traffic. "Morning, Sarah," called Dr. Harrison as he passed by her desk. "How are we looking on yesterday's surgical reports?" "Just starting the reconciliation now," Sarah replied, not looking up from her screen. "Should have everything ready for your review by noon." It was around 10 a.m. when she started the detailed cross-referencing process. This was the part of her job that required the most concentration, matching pre-operative records with post-operative summaries, ensuring that every patient who went into surgery had a corresponding discharge summary. She opened the pre-op authorization folder for March 14th and began counting. 14 authorizations for operating room Block C. Next, she pulled up the anesthesia records. 14 anesthesia records. Then came the surgical consent forms. 14 consent forms. Everything was matching perfectly. Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction of numbers aligning properly. She took another sip of her coffee and moved on to the post-operative records. This was where things started to feel wrong. She pulled up the post-op summaries for March 14th, Block C, and began counting. 1, 2, 3. She counted again, more slowly this time. 13 post-operative summaries. She frowned and rechecked her search parameters. Still 13. In 8 years of medical records work, she'd seen plenty of filing errors, but she'd never seen a discrepancy quite like this. 14 patients going in, only 13 coming out, at least according to the paperwork. She pulled up each of the 14 pre-op authorizations and tried to match them with corresponding post-op summaries. The first 13 matched perfectly. But the 14th authorization, patient ID number 47291, a 38-year-old male named James Chen scheduled for emergency bowel surgery with Dr. Morrison at 2:30 p.m., had no matching post-op summary. No discharge paperwork. No record of the patient ever leaving the operating room. Sarah stared at the screen. Patient number 47291 existed in the pre-op system, but seemed to have vanished from the post-op records entirely. She checked the patient's primary file. His admission paperwork was there, documenting his arrival at the emergency room at 11:45 a.m. on March 14th with severe abdominal pain. But after 2:30 p.m. on March 14th, James Chen simply disappeared from the hospital's records. Sarah decided to check with the charge nurse for operating room Block C. Patricia Coleman had been working surgical nursing for 23 years. If anyone would remember the details of March 14th, it would be her. She found Patricia in the surgical prep area, reviewing schedules for the day's procedures. Patricia was a tall, stern woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, the kind of nurse who could intimidate junior doctors with a single glance. "Patricia, do you have a minute?" Sarah asked, clutching the printed pre-op authorization for patient number 47291. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "I'm doing the reconciliation for yesterday's surgeries in Block C, and I'm having trouble tracking down the post-op paperwork for one patient. James Chen, bowel obstruction, scheduled with Dr. Morrison at 2:30 p.m. Patient ID 47291. Do you remember anything about that case?" Patricia's face changed. It was subtle, a slight tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible pause before responding, but Sarah noticed it immediately. "You know, honey," Patricia said slowly, "yesterday was such a busy day. So many cases, so many complications. I'm not sure I remember all the specific details." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. Patricia Coleman remembered everything. In all her years of working with the surgical staff, Sarah had never known Patricia to forget a patient or a procedure. The woman had an encyclopedic memory for surgical details. "But the pre-op authorization is dated and signed," Sarah pressed gently. "And there's an anesthesia record showing that the patient was prepped and ready for surgery." Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sometimes the paperwork gets filed even if the procedure doesn't happen. You know how busy it gets down here. Mistakes happen. There was something final in Patricia's tone, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Sarah had worked in the hospital long enough to recognize when she was being dismissed. "Of course," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "I'll keep looking through the files." As she walked back toward the medical records department, Sarah's mind raced. Patricia Coleman didn't make mistakes about surgical schedules. She didn't forget patients, which meant that something had happened to James Chen, something that nobody wanted to talk about. She was staring at her computer screen, lost in thought, when Dr. Morrison appeared beside her desk. "Sarah, I heard you were asking Patricia about yesterday's surgical schedule." Dr. Morrison was generally well-liked among the staff, a competent surgeon with good bedside manner. But standing next to Sarah's desk, he looked uncomfortable, almost nervous. "Just doing the routine reconciliation," Sarah said carefully. "Of course. Very important work." Dr. Morrison shifted his weight. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't having any problems with the documentation. Actually, I am having one small issue. I'm having trouble finding the post-op summary for one of your cases yesterday. James Chen, bowel obstruction, scheduled for 2:30 p.m. The change in Dr. Morrison's expression was dramatic and immediate. The color drained from his face, and his eyes darted around the office as if checking to see who might be listening. "Sarah, I think there might be some confusion about the scheduling. Yesterday was very hectic, lots of last-minute changes. Sometimes the pre-op paperwork gets filed even when procedures are canceled or rescheduled." It was almost the exact same explanation Patricia had given her. Almost word for word. "Look, Sarah, you do excellent work. Everyone knows that. But sometimes in this job, it's better to focus on the cases that are straightforward. The insurance auditors don't need to see every little scheduling confusion." Dr. Morrison's hand briefly touched Sarah's shoulder, meant to be reassuring, but it felt more like a warning. "I'm sure you understand. We all want what's best for St. Francis, right?" After he left, Sarah sat at her desk in stunned silence. In 8 years of working at St. Francis Hospital, she had never been told to ignore a discrepancy in the medical records. But now, within the span of 2 hours, both the charge nurse and the attending surgeon had told her to essentially forget about patient number 47291. By 5 p.m., as her shift was ending, Sarah had made a decision. She was going to find out what happened to James Chen, even if nobody else wanted to talk about it. Because 14 people had gone into surgery on March 14th, but only 13 had come out. And in a hospital where every aspirin tablet was counted and tracked, people didn't just disappear without a trace. Not unless someone wanted them to. March 16, 2002, 7:15 a.m. Sarah arrived at work early again, but this time her motivation was different. She'd spent most of the previous evening thinking about James Chen and the strange reactions from Patricia and Dr. Morrison. She decided to examine the entire surgical schedule for March 14th, looking for patterns that might explain what happened. She pulled up the complete surgical logs for all operating rooms on March 14th. St. Francis had 12 operating rooms divided into 3 blocks. March 14th had been busy across all blocks, but Block C having 14 procedures was unusual. The typical maximum was around 10 or 11. She began examining each Block C procedure in detail. The first 12 surgeries had straightforward documentation, normal recovery times, and complete post-operative records. Procedure 13 was James Chen's bowel obstruction surgery, scheduled for 2:30 p.m. And Procedure 14 made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. There was a 14th entry, but it was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The patient ID was listed as not applicable. The patient name field was blank. The procedure was described only as emergency intervention, and the scheduled surgeon was listed as multiple staff. The timestamp showed 4:45 p.m., more than 2 hours after James Chen's scheduled surgery. In 8 years of medical records work, she'd never seen a surgical schedule entry like this. Every patient had to have a name and ID number. Every procedure had to have a specific medical description. Every surgery had to have a designated primary surgeon. This entry violated every basic rule of hospital record-keeping. She tried to click on the entry to access more details, but the system froze. Her screen went completely black. When it flickered back to life, she was back at the main menu. She tried to navigate back to the March 14th surgical logs, but this time there were only 13 entries. The mysterious 14th entry had disappeared entirely. Sarah's hands were shaking. She knew what she'd seen. Something else had happened in Operating Room Block C on March 14th, an emergency intervention with multiple staff that someone wanted to erase from the official record. At 9:30 a.m., she decided to talk to Kevin Martinez, a surgical technician known for his meticulous attention to detail and photographic memory for procedures. "Hey, Kevin," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "Do you have a minute to help me with something?" "Sure, Sarah. What's up?" "I'm doing the paperwork reconciliation for Thursday's surgeries in Block C, and I'm having trouble matching up some documentation. Do you remember anything unusual about that day?" Kevin's expression immediately became guarded. "Thursday was pretty busy." "Why do you ask?" "Well, I'm showing 14 pre-op authorizations, but I can only find 13 post-op summaries. And James Chen, bowel obstruction with Dr. Morrison, doesn't seem to have any post-surgical documentation." The change in Kevin's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and he took a step back. I'm not sure I remember that specific case. Thursday was really hectic. But you were assisting Dr. Morrison that afternoon, right?" Maybe I was. But we were short-staffed. People were covering multiple rooms. Everything blurs together when it gets busy. Sarah had known Kevin for 6 years. He could tell you exactly which sutures were used in a procedure 3 months ago. The idea that he couldn't remember specific details from 2 days ago was absurd. "Sarah." The voice came from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Harrison, her supervisor, standing in the doorway. His expression was stern. "Dr. Harrison, I need to see you in my office. Now." In his office, Dr. Harrison closed the door firmly. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with Dr. Morrison. He tells me you've been asking questions about March 14th surgical procedures. I was just doing the routine reconciliation for the insurance audit. There are discrepancies that need to be resolved." And then Kevin Martinez called to say you were in the surgical wing asking about specific patients. "That's not part of your job responsibilities, Sarah. We don't conduct investigations in clinical areas." Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "Sarah, you've been an excellent employee for 8 years. I don't want to see you damage your reputation by overstepping your boundaries. My job is to ensure medical records are complete and accurate. When I find discrepancies, I investigate them." "Sometimes," Dr. Harrison said quietly, "the most professional approach is to recognize when a situation is complex and focus our attention on areas where we can make the most positive impact." "Are you telling me to ignore missing documentation?" Dr. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I'm telling you that sometimes there are situations in a hospital that are beyond the scope of routine documentation. Situations that require discretion rather than investigation." "What kind of situations?" "The kind that could damage the reputation of good people if misunderstood. The kind that could hurt the hospital's ability to serve patients if blown out of proportion. The kind better left to people with more context than medical records coordinators have." The implicit threat was clear. Keep asking questions, and your job might be in jeopardy. At lunchtime, Sarah drove to the Hartford Public Library. She searched newspaper archives for stories about St. Francis Hospital around March 14, 2002. She found community news, but nothing about surgical complications or missing patients. Then she searched for unusual incidents at hospitals in March 2002. What she found made her stomach drop. On March 18, 2002, 4 days after the incident, a Hartford Courant story ran with the headline, "Hospital officials investigate unusual surgical scheduling error." The brief story described how a Hartford area hospital had discovered discrepancies in surgical records requiring administrative review. No hospital name was mentioned, no specific details provided. The timing was too much of a coincidence. The story had run exactly 4 days after March 14th, exactly the time it would take for someone to notice missing documentation and escalate it to administration. Sarah printed the article and stared at it. The story was clearly about St. Francis, clearly about James Chen. But it was also clearly a cover story, acknowledging there had been a scheduling error without providing real details, which suggested that whatever happened on March 14th was serious enough to attract outside attention, but contained enough to keep the real story out of the press. As she drove back, Sarah realized she was looking at a coordinated cover-up involving multiple departments, multiple staff members, and possibly people outside the hospital. The question was, what had happened to James Chen that was worth such elaborate effort to hide? March 16, 2002, 11:30 p.m. Sarah couldn't sleep. At 11:15 p.m., she made a decision that felt necessary but reckless. She was going back to the hospital. St. Francis looked different at night, mostly empty parking lot, dimmer emergency lighting casting long shadows down corridors. She badged in through the employee entrance, grateful her access card worked all shifts. The hospital felt quieter at night, but not peaceful. There was an underlying tension, as if the building itself was holding secrets. Sarah made her way to the medical records department, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She settled at her workstation and began accessing files she couldn't review during normal hours: personnel records, incident reports, and administrative databases that required special clearance. She started with Dr. Morrison's employment file. Hired in 1995, excellent performance reviews, no disciplinary actions. Clean record. Then she checked Patricia Coleman's file, 30 years at St. Francis, commendations for patient care, exemplary record. These weren't people who made mistakes or engaged in cover-ups, which made their behavior about James Chen even more disturbing. Next, she accessed the incident report database for March 2002. This system tracked everything from medication errors to equipment failures to patient complaints. If something had gone wrong during James Chen's surgery, there should be documentation here. She found 17 incident reports for March 2002, but none dated March 14th. No surgical complications, no equipment failures, no patient safety issues. According to the official record, March 14th had been a perfectly normal day. But Sarah had learned not to trust official records. She tried a different approach, accessing the hospital's internal email system. Her position gave her administrative access to archived messages, a privilege she'd rarely used, but one that might reveal communications about the missing patient. She searched for emails containing James Chen during the week of March 14th. No results. She tried patient 47291. Nothing. Then she searched more broadly for emails mentioning Block C or surgical complications during that period. What she found made her hands shake. On March 15th, at 6:23 a.m., just hours after the surgical procedures, Dr. Harrison had sent an email to hospital administration with the subject line, "Documentation review required." The message was brief: "Need immediate administrative review of yesterday's surgical schedules. Recommend legal consultation before insurance audit. Confidential matter." At 7:45 a.m. that same day, the hospital's chief of staff had responded, "Review committee formed. All relevant personnel to maintain strict confidentiality pending investigation." No documentation changes without committee approval. And at 8:30 a.m., there was a message from the hospital's legal department. All staff briefed on confidentiality requirements. Media protocols in place. Situation contained. Sarah stared at the screen. This wasn't just a medical error or paperwork mistake. Within hours of James Chen's disappearance, the hospital had formed a review committee, consulted legal counsel, and implemented media protocols. This was crisis management for something serious. She continued searching through the archived emails. On March 16, yesterday, there was a message from Dr. Harrison to all medical record staff. Reminder: all documentation discrepancies must be reported to supervision before investigation. No staff member should conduct independent research into patient records without proper authorization. The message had been sent at 2:15 p.m., just hours after Sarah's conversation with Dr. Harrison about James Chen. As Sarah continued digging through the email archives, she found a pattern of messages that painted a disturbing picture. References to the situation, mentions of maintaining institutional reputation, and repeated emphasis on confidentiality requirements. But the most chilling discovery came when she found an email thread between Dr. Morrison and the hospital's chief of surgery. The messages were heavily coded, but the implications were clear. Patient outcome requires special handling. Family notification completed through alternative channels. Documentation adjusted per legal guidance. Matter resolved. No further action required. Sarah felt sick. They weren't just hiding James Chen's disappearance. They were actively managing it, controlling every aspect of how it was documented and communicated. At 2:30 a.m., she made another disturbing discovery. While searching through administrative databases, she found a file she'd never seen before, a restricted database labeled Special Circumstances Documentation. Her access credentials allowed her to view it, but barely. Inside, she found a single entry dated March 14, 2002, patient number 47291, administrative hold, legal review pending, access restricted. Below that was a note that made her blood run cold. Family contacted. Compensation agreement signed. Confidentiality clause in effect. Case closed. James Chen hadn't just disappeared from the hospital's records. He'd been systematically erased. And his family had been paid to stay quiet about it. Sarah printed out everything she could access, her mind racing. This wasn't medical malpractice or a surgical error. This was something much worse, something that required legal agreements and financial compensation to keep hidden. As she gathered the printed documents, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the medical records department. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that stopped right outside the door. Sarah quickly logged out of all systems and stuffed the documents into her purse. The footsteps continued past the door, but she could feel her heart pounding. If someone caught her here at this hour, accessing restricted files, her job would be over. And based on what she'd discovered, her job might be the least of her concerns. She waited 10 minutes before leaving, taking a different route through the hospital to avoid whoever had been walking the corridors. As she made her way to the parking lot, Sarah realized that she'd crossed a line tonight. She wasn't just investigating missing paperwork anymore. She was uncovering evidence of a conspiracy. The question was, what was she going to do with that evidence? And the more frightening question, what would the hospital do to her if they discovered what she knew? March 17, 2002, 10:30 a.m. Sarah barely slept after her midnight discovery at the hospital. By morning, she'd made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find James Chen's family. The email she'd found mentioned that they'd been contacted and had signed a confidentiality agreement. If she could find them, she might finally learn what really happened in Operating Room Block C. She called in sick to work, the first sick day she'd taken in 3 years, and drove to the Hartford County Records Office. Using the limited information from James Chen's admission paperwork, she began searching public records for anyone with that name in the area. After 2 hours of searching, she found what she was looking for. James Chen, age 38, address listed as 47 Maple Street in West Hartford. Married to Linda Chen, employed as an accountant at a local firm. 2 children, ages 12 and 9. The address led her to a modest 2-story house in a quiet residential neighborhood. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, gathering courage. What was she going to say? How do you ask a family about a loved one who officially never existed? Finally, she walked up to the front door and rang the bell. A woman in her mid-30s answered, Asian American, with tired eyes and the kind of forced smile that comes from dealing with too much pain. Mrs. Chen? Sarah asked. My name is Sarah Martinez. I work at St. Francis Hospital, and I was hoping I could talk to you about your husband. The change in Linda Chen's expression was immediate and devastating. The polite mask fell away, replaced by raw grief and something else, fear. I can't. Linda Chen's voice was barely a whisper. Please, I can't talk about that. Mrs. Chen, I know something happened to James at the hospital. I've been trying to find out what, and I think you might be the only person who can help me understand. Linda Chen looked around nervously, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then she stepped back and motioned Sarah inside. The living room was neat but felt heavy with sadness. Family photos showed a happy couple with 2 young children, normal family moments that now seemed frozen in time. Linda Chen sat on the edge of her couch, her hands trembling slightly. You said you work at the hospital? Medical Records Department. I've been there 8 years. Mrs. Chen, according to our surgical records, your husband was scheduled for bowel obstruction surgery on March 14th, but there's no documentation of what happened after he went into the operating room. He just disappeared from our records. Linda Chen was quiet for a long moment, tears forming in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow. They told me he died during surgery. Complications with the anesthesia. They said it was nobody's fault, just one of those things that sometimes happen. But that's not what really happened, is it? Linda Chen shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. I signed papers. I promised I wouldn't talk about it. They said it was to protect the hospital's reputation, to protect other patients from losing confidence in the medical system. What did they offer you to stay quiet? Money. Enough to pay off our house, put the kids through college. They said James would have wanted me to think about the children's future. And they said... She paused, struggling with the words. They said that if I talked about what really happened, other families might sue the hospital, and good doctors might lose their jobs, and patients who needed help might not get it. Sarah felt sick. They'd used this woman's grief and her concern for others to buy her silence. Mrs. Chen, what really happened to James? Linda Chen was quiet for several minutes, visibly wrestling with her conscience. Finally, she spoke. James went into surgery at 2:30 that afternoon. Everything seemed normal at first. But around 4 o'clock, Dr. Morrison came out looking shaken. He said there had been a complication, that they needed to do additional procedures to save James's life. She took a shaky breath. But it wasn't Dr. Morrison who came out next. It was Dr. Patterson, and he looked different. Scared. He asked me to come into a private room, and that's when he told me that James had died. But he wouldn't let me see the body. He said there had been complications. That made it too difficult. What kind of complications? They never told me exactly. But I heard nurses talking in the hallway. Something about how the surgery had gone wrong, how they'd had to call in multiple specialists, how something had happened that they'd never seen before. Linda Chen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. The funeral was closed casket. They said the complications had made it necessary. I never saw my husband's body, Sarah. I never got to say goodbye properly. Sarah felt a chill. Did they tell you anything else about what happened during the surgery? Only that there had been an unprecedented medical event. That's the phrase they kept using. They said that sometimes, very rarely, patients react to surgical procedures in ways that medical science can't fully explain. They said James had been one of those rare cases. But you don't believe that. Linda Chen turned back to Sarah, her expression a mixture of grief and anger. I think something went wrong. Something so bad that they needed to cover it up. And I think they used my grief and my children's future to buy my silence. She walked to a desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a thick folder. These are all the papers they made me sign. Confidentiality agreements, settlement documents, legal waivers. I kept copies of everything. Sarah looked through the documents, her horror growing with each page. Not only had the hospital paid Linda Chen to stay quiet, but they'd also required her to agree that any discussion of James's death could result in the family having to pay back the settlement money. Mrs. Chen, there's something else I need to tell you. I found evidence that your husband wasn't the only patient who went missing from the hospital records that day. There was some kind of emergency procedure that happened after his surgery, something involving multiple staff members that they've also erased from the system. Linda Chen stared at Sarah. You think something happened to James that was so bad, it required additional emergency procedures? I think something happened that was so unusual, so unprecedented, that the hospital decided it could never become public knowledge. And I think they've been covering it up ever since. Linda Chen was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with a decision. Finally, she spoke. There's something else. Something I never told anyone, not even the lawyers. She walked back to the desk and pulled out a small object, a ring. This was James's wedding ring. They gave it back to me after he died, said they'd removed it before the surgery. She handed the ring to Sarah. Look at it closely. Sarah examined the ring under the living room lamp. At first, it looked like a normal gold wedding band. But as she turned it in the light, she noticed something strange. There were tiny marks on the metal, not scratches or normal wear, but what looked like burn marks. And the gold itself seemed somehow altered, as if it had been exposed to extreme heat or some kind of chemical process. The hospital said these marks were from the emergency procedures, from the equipment they had to use to try to save James's life. But Sarah, I've never seen anything like this before. What kind of medical procedure could do this to solid gold? Sarah stared at the ring, her mind racing. She'd worked in medical records for 8 years, had seen documentation for every type of surgical procedure, every kind of emergency intervention. She'd never heard of anything that could alter metal like this. Mrs. Chen, I think your husband encountered something in that operating room that the hospital has never seen before. Something so unusual that they decided it could never be documented or discussed. But what could be that unprecedented? What could happen during surgery that would be worth this level of cover-up? Sarah looked at the ring again, noting how the burn marks seemed to form patterns, almost like they'd been created by some kind of energy discharge rather than normal heat. I don't know. But I'm going to find out. As Sarah prepared to leave, Linda Chen grabbed her arm. Be careful. The people I dealt with after James died, they weren't just hospital administrators. There were lawyers, people from outside the hospital, people who seemed to have a lot of authority. This thing, whatever it is, goes beyond just St. Francis. Driving home, Sarah's mind was reeling. James Chen had died during or after his surgery, but his death had been so unusual that the hospital had paid his family to stay silent and had erased all evidence of what happened. The burn marks on his wedding ring suggested some kind of energy or chemical process that wasn't part of normal medical procedures. And the mysterious emergency intervention entry she'd seen in the computer system suggested that whatever happened to James had triggered additional emergency procedures involving multiple staff members. For the first time since this all began, Sarah was starting to understand the scope of what she'd uncovered. This wasn't just medical malpractice or a surgical error. This was something unprecedented, something so unusual that it had required a coordinated cover-up involving legal agreements, financial settlements, and the systematic erasure of medical records. But she still didn't know what had actually happened in Operating Room Block C on March 14, 2002. And she was beginning to realize that the truth might be more disturbing than she'd ever imagined. March 18, 2002, 3:45 p.m. Sarah returned to work the next day with a plan. She'd spent the entire night thinking about James Chen's wedding ring, the burn marks, and Linda Chen's description of her husband's death as an unprecedented medical event. She needed to find someone who might have been present during the emergency procedures, someone who hadn't been briefed on the hospital's confidentiality requirements. During her lunch break, she went to the hospital's employee break room and casually struck up conversations with staff from different departments. She was looking for someone who might have worked late on March 14th, someone who might have seen or heard something unusual. She found him in the most unlikely place. Jerry Vasquez, a night janitor who'd been working at St. Francis for 15 years. Jerry was eating lunch alone in the corner of the break room, and Sarah recognized him as someone who often worked overtime, covering shifts when other janitors called in sick. "Jerry, right?" Sarah said, sitting down across from him. "I'm Sarah, from Medical Records." Jerry looked up, surprised. Hospital staff rarely talked to the janitors beyond basic pleasantries. "Yeah, that's me. How's it going?" "Good, thanks. I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm trying to figure out some scheduling issues from last Thursday, March 14th. Were you working that night?" Jerry nodded. "Yeah, I was here. Had to cover for Rodriguez. His kid was sick." "Why? Did you notice anything unusual that night? Any extra activity in the surgical wing, maybe around Operating Room Block C?" Jerry's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "Why are you asking?" Sarah decided to take a risk. "Because something happened that night that everyone's trying to pretend didn't happen. And I think you might have seen it." Jerry was quiet for a long moment, looking around to make sure no one was listening. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Look, I've been working here 15 years. I mind my own business, do my job, go home. But that night, that was different." "What did you see?" "Around 5 p.m., I was cleaning the corridors near Block C when all hell broke loose. Alarms started going off, doctors and nurses running everywhere. But it wasn't like a normal emergency. Everyone looked scared, not just concerned." Jerry leaned forward. "Then they cleared everyone out of that whole section. Posted security guards at the entrances. I've never seen anything like that before." "What happened next?" "Around 7 p.m., they brought in people from outside. Not hospital staff, people in suits, people with equipment I'd never seen before. They went into Operating Room C3 and stayed there for hours." Sarah's heart was racing. What kind of equipment? Metal cases, electronic devices, things that looked scientific but not medical, if you know what I mean. And the weird part was the smell. Smell. When I was cleaning the adjacent corridor around midnight, there was this smell coming from that area. Not like normal hospital smells, not antiseptic or surgical. It smelled like burned metal, ozone, like after lightning strikes. The burned metal. Just like James Chen's wedding ring. "Jerry, did you see anything else? Anything that might explain what they were doing in there?" Jerry hesitated, then made a decision. "I wasn't supposed to be there, but around 2 a.m. I went back to finish cleaning that section. The security guards were gone, the outside people had left. But the door to C3 was propped open for ventilation. And I looked inside. The operating table was melted. Not burned, not damaged, melted, like it had been exposed to incredible heat. But there were no burn marks on the walls or ceiling, No fire damage. Just the table, melted into this twisted metal sculpture. Sarah stared at him. Melted. And there were scorch marks on the floor in a perfect circle around where the table used to be. Like something had discharged energy in all directions from a central point. I've never seen anything like it. What did you do? I got out of there as fast as I could. The next morning, they'd replaced everything. New table, new flooring, new equipment. Like nothing had ever happened. And they transferred me to a different section of the hospital. Said they needed me in the pediatric wing instead. Sarah felt like the pieces of a horrifying puzzle were finally coming together. James Chen had gone into surgery for a routine bowel obstruction. But something had happened during that procedure. Something that had generated enough energy to melt a surgical table and burn patterns into the floor. Jerry, in your opinion, what do you think happened in that room? Jerry was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was troubled. In 15 years of working here, I've seen a lot of things. Medical emergencies, equipment failures, even some accidents that the hospital didn't want publicized. But this was different. This wasn't medical, Sarah. This was something else entirely. What do you mean? Whatever happened to that patient, it wasn't a surgical complication or medical error. It was some kind of energy discharge, some kind of phenomenon that I don't think medicine has a name for. And I think the hospital brought in outside experts because they didn't know how to handle it either. As Sarah walked back to her desk, her mind was reeling. Jerry's description of the melted surgical table and the energy discharge patterns confirmed her worst fears. James Chen hadn't just died during surgery. Something unprecedented had happened to him, something that had released enough energy to melt metal and require the involvement of outside specialists. But what could cause such a phenomenon? And why would it happen during routine surgery? That afternoon, Sarah made one final search through the hospital's databases, this time looking for any other unusual incidents involving energy discharges or equipment damage. What she found made her blood run cold. Buried in the maintenance records, she discovered repair orders for Block C that had been filed on March 15, 2002. The orders were coded as emergency electrical repairs and equipment replacement due to power surge damage. But the details were revealing. Complete electrical rewiring of operating room C3, replacement of all surgical equipment, installation of new grounding systems, and specialized consultation for unusual electrical phenomena. The repair costs totaled over $200,000, an enormous sum for what should have been routine maintenance. Sarah also found a record of a specialized cleaning crew that had been brought in from outside the hospital. The work order was coded as biohazard remediation and chemical residue removal. The cleaning crew had worked for 3 days, using equipment and chemicals that weren't part of the hospital's normal maintenance inventory. Whatever had happened to James Chen, it had been so intense that it had required specialized cleanup crews and electrical contractors. The hospital had spent a fortune covering up the physical evidence of the event. But the most chilling discovery came when Sarah found a memo from the hospital's insurance company. The document, dated March 20, 2002, referenced a unique incident requiring specialized coverage review, and mentioned that standard medical malpractice policies might not cover events of unknown scientific origin. Even the insurance company didn't know how to classify what had happened. As her shift ended, Sarah realized that she'd uncovered as much truth as she was likely to find within the hospital systems. James Chen had died during surgery, but his death had involved some kind of unprecedented energy phenomenon that had destroyed equipment, required specialized cleanup, and prompted the hospital to pay his family for their silence. The emergency intervention entry she'd found had likely been the hospital's attempt to deal with whatever had happened to James, bringing in multiple specialists to contain and clean up the aftermath of an event they couldn't explain or document through normal medical channels. 14 patients had gone into surgery on March 14, but only 13 had come out because James Chen had encountered something in operating room C3 that existed outside the normal boundaries of medical science. and the hospital had decided that such an event could never become public knowledge. As Sarah gathered her things to leave, she realized that she now faced an impossible choice. She had evidence of a massive cover-up, but revealing it would destroy the careers of people she respected, potentially bankrupt the hospital, and expose patients to fears about medical procedures that they might not be equipped to handle. But she also knew that somewhere out there, other patients might encounter the same phenomenon that had killed James Chen. And if the medical community never learned about it, never studied it, never developed protocols for dealing with it, more people might die. The question was the truth worth the consequences? And as Sarah walked to her car in the gathering darkness, she realized that some questions don't have easy answers. Sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones that nobody wants to hear, even when lives might depend on them. She never spoke publicly about what she'd discovered. But every night for the rest of her career, Sarah Martinez would wonder about James Chen and the unprecedented event that had taken his life. And she would wonder if, somewhere in another hospital, another patient was about to encounter the same inexplicable phenomenon. Because in medicine, as in life, there are some mysteries that science hasn't solved yet. And sometimes, the people who discover those mysteries are asked to carry the burden of silence, protecting society from truths it isn't ready to face. But the numbers don't lie. On March 14, 2002, 14 patients went into surgery at St. Francis Hospital. Only 13 came out. And the 14th patient encountered something that changed everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between life and death. March 2015, 13 years later. Sarah Martinez retired from St. Francis Hospital after 21 years of service. Her farewell party was well attended, filled with colleagues who praised her dedication to accuracy and patient safety. But as she cleaned out her desk, she found a small envelope she'd hidden years ago. Inside was a copy of James Chen's preoperative authorization form, the only physical evidence she'd kept of the case that had haunted her career. She'd never known what to do with it, never known whether keeping it made her a guardian of important truth or simply someone who couldn't let go of an impossible mystery. As she walked out of St. Francis for the last time, Sarah passed operating room Block C. The rooms looked exactly the same as they had 13 years ago, filled with the most advanced medical equipment money could buy. But she knew that room C3 had been completely rebuilt, every surface replaced, every system upgraded. Sometimes, late at night, she still wondered about the energy discharge that had melted a surgical table and changed the course of James Chen's family forever. She wondered if other hospitals had encountered similar phenomena, if other medical records coordinators had discovered similar impossibilities in their files. But mostly, she wondered if the silence had been worth it. If protecting people from inexplicable truths was really more important than the transparency that medical science required to advance and improve. She never found an answer to that question. But she never forgot that sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that never get told. What happens when we encounter mysteries that science can't explain? When medical professionals must choose between transparency and protecting the public from unsettling truths? Sarah Martinez's story reminds us that in our most trusted institutions, there may be questions that don't have comfortable answers. The next time you walk into a hospital, remember that behind every room, every procedure, every routine medical intervention, there are human beings making impossible choices about what we should know and what we're better off not knowing. Because sometimes, the scariest truth isn't what we discover, it's what we decide to keep hidden.